You think you know medieval warfare, you think knights were honorable warriors who fought with chivalry and grace. Think again. Behind the romantic tales of Arthur and his round table lies a darker truth. Weapons so horrifically effective at causing pain and death that even medieval societies, known for their brutality, said enough. But here's what really happened when warfare became so savage that kings, popes, and military commanders had to step in and literally ban certain weapons from existence. These weren't just tools of war, they were instruments of terror that crossed the line from tactical advantage into pure, calculated cruelty. Just imagine living in an age where your enemies could legally torture you to death on the battlefield, where weapons were specifically designed not to kill you quickly but to make you suffer as much as possible before you died. That's the medieval reality we're about to explore. You have to understand something about medieval society. It was built on a very specific hierarchy. At the top sat the heavily armored knight, a professional warrior who had trained since childhood, equipped with the finest weapons and armor that money could buy. These men were virtually unstoppable on the battlefield. And that's exactly how the ruling class wanted it. But here's where it gets interesting. Around the 11th century, a weapon emerged that changed everything. The crossbow. Now I know what you're thinking. Crossbows don't seem that brutal compared to other medieval weapons. But you're missing the bigger picture. The crossbow wasn't banned because it was particularly gruesome. It was banned because it was too effective, too democratic. A peasant with a crossbow could kill a knight with decades of training and thousands of pounds worth of equipment. Just imagine. You spend your entire life learning swordplay. You invest a fortune in armor and weapons, and then some farmer's son puts a bolt through your visor from 2,000 yards away. That's when things got interesting. In 1139, Pope Innocent II and the Second Lateran Council declared the crossbow hateful to God and unfit for Christians. But here's what really happened. This wasn't about theology. This was about preserving the social order. The church specifically banned the use of crossbows against Christians. But notably, they were perfectly acceptable to use against Muslims and other non-Christians. That tells you everything you need about the real motivation behind this prohibition. It wasn't the weapon itself that was the problem. It was what the weapon represented. You see, medieval warfare was supposed to be personal. A knight was expected to look his enemy in the eye, to engage in honorable combat where skill, training, and divine favor determined the outcome. The crossbow destroyed all of that. It was impersonal, it required minimal training, and it could penetrate the finest armor available. But here's the thing about trying to ban technology. It rarely works. Despite papal prohibition, crossbows continued to spread across Europe. Military commanders quickly realized that moral qualms meant nothing when facing an enemy equipped with these weapons. By the 13th century, crossbows were standard equipment in most European armies. The failure of the crossbow ban taught medieval rulers an important lesson about the nature of warfare and technology. You can't uninvent something just because it upsets the established order. This would become a recurring theme as we explore the other weapons on this list. That says a lot about medieval society. They were willing to accept brutal hand-to-hand combat, horrific injuries from swords and maces, and all the carnage of traditional warfare. But a weapon that threatened the social hierarchy, that was going too far. Picture this. You're a medieval sailor approaching the walls of Constantinople, and suddenly the sea around your ship erupts in flames that can't be extinguished by water. The fire sticks to everything it touches, wood, cloth, flesh, and burns with an intensity that seems almost supernatural. Welcome to the nightmare of Greek fire. But here's what really happened when the Byzantine Empire developed what was essentially medieval napalm. This wasn't just another weapon. It was a state secret so closely guarded that we still don't know exactly how it was made, even today. Greek fire was invented around 600 AD by a Syrian refugee named Kallinicus, and it became the Byzantine Empire's most powerful military asset. The formula was so secret that it was passed down through only one family, and the knowledge died with them. That's how seriously they took this weapon. You have to understand the psychological impact of Greek fire. Medieval soldiers were accustomed to blood, violence, and brutal death, but there was something uniquely terrifying about a fire that burned on water, that couldn't be extinguished, that would consume ships, men, and everything it touched with seemingly demonic persistence. The weapon was deployed through bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine ships, essentially functioning as flamethrowers. When enemy vessels approached, Byzantine operators would spray this liquid fire across the water, creating walls of flame that could destroy entire fleets. The sight was so terrifying that many enemies would flee without engaging in combat. But here's where it gets interesting. Greek fire wasn't banned by any formal treaty or religious decree. Instead, it was effectively banned by its own secrecy. The Byzantines were so protective of the formula that they never shared it with allies, never allowed it to be produced outside their direct control, and never documented the process in any way that has survived. That's when things got really problematic. As the Byzantine Empire declined in power, the knowledge of Greek fire began to disappear. By the time Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the secret was already lost. The weapon that had protected the Byzantine Empire for centuries vanished along with the empire itself. Modern historians and chemists have attempted to recreate Greek fire based on contemporary accounts, but none have succeeded in producing something with the exact properties described in historical sources. The closest approximations suggest it was likely based on petroleum or naphtha, combined with other chemicals to make it stick to surfaces and resist water. Just imagine the strategic implications of possessing a weapon that your enemies couldn't replicate or defend against. Greek fire gave the Byzantines a technological advantage that lasted for centuries, allowing a declining empire to punch far above its weight in naval conflicts. But the story of Greek fire also illustrates the dangers of excessive secrecy. By refusing to share the knowledge even with trusted allies, the Byzantines ensured that the secret would die with them. In trying to maintain their monopoly, they guaranteed the weapon's extinction. That says a lot about medieval attitudes toward military technology. It was seen as something to be hoarded rather than developed collaboratively. This mindset would prove costly as more open societies began to innovate more rapidly in military affairs. You think medieval combat was about swift, clean deaths? Think again. The Morning Star, that spiked ball of metal, attached to a handle or chain, was specifically designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping enemies alive long enough to experience every moment of their agony. But here's what really happened when medieval weaponsmiths decided that simply killing your enemy wasn't enough. You needed to make them suffer first. The Morning Star wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological warfare tool that could break entire armies through sheer terror. The Morning Star came in several variations, but the most feared was the flail version, a heavy spiked ball attached to a handle by a chain. When swung properly, this weapon could generate tremendous force while the spikes tore through armor, flesh, and bone. But here's the truly brutal part. The spikes were designed not to penetrate deeply enough to cause immediate death, but to create massive trauma and internal bleeding that would ensure a slow, agonizing end. You have to understand the physics of what this weapon did to the human body. Unlike a sword which could deliver a clean cut, or an arrow which might kill quickly if it hit a vital organ, the Morning Star specialized in what we now call blunt force trauma. The weight of the metal ball would shatter bones, while the spikes would puncture organs and tear muscle. Medieval medical knowledge was primitive by modern standards, so wounds inflicted by Morning Stars were essentially death sentences, just slow ones. Victims might survive the initial impact only to die days or weeks later from internal bleeding, infection, or organ failure. The weapon was designed to maximize suffering. That's when things got interesting from a tactical perspective. The Morning Star wasn't just about killing individual enemies. It was about psychological warfare on a massive scale. The sight of comrades writhing in agony from Morning Star wounds could break the morale of entire units. But here's where the weapon's effectiveness became its downfall. Various military orders and kingdoms began banning Morning Stars not because they were ineffective, but because they were considered unnecessarily cruel. The concept of honorable warfare, as contradictory as that might seem, began to emerge in medieval military culture.
Engineered instruments of strategic disruption that could neutralize the most powerful military force of the medieval period. Heavy cavalry. A caltrop was deceptively simple. 4 metal spikes arranged so that no matter how it landed, one spike always pointed upward. These devices were scattered across battlefields, roads, and approaches to castles, creating invisible minefields that could cripple armies and terrorize civilian populations. You have to understand the strategic importance of cavalry in medieval warfare. Knights on horseback weren't just individual warriors, they were living tanks, capable of smashing through infantry formations and turning the tide of entire battles. The sight of charging heavy cavalry could break enemy morale before combat even began. That's when caltrops changed everything. Suddenly, the most powerful military force of the age could be neutralized by scattered pieces of metal that cost almost nothing to produce. A peasant blacksmith could create hundreds of caltrops for the price of a single sword, and those caltrops could disable warhorses worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. But here's where it gets really interesting. Caltrops were often banned not for their effectiveness against military targets, but for their impact on civilian populations. Unlike other weapons that were primarily used in formal battles, caltrops could be scattered along roads, around villages, or near water sources, creating long-term hazards for non-combatants. The indiscriminate nature of caltrops made them particularly controversial. A knight could at least choose whether to engage in combat, but a farmer walking to market had no way to know if his path was seeded with these devices. Horses, oxen, and other livestock, essential for medieval agriculture, were particularly vulnerable. Medieval armies began using caltrops for what we would now call psychological warfare. The knowledge that roads might be seeded with these devices could paralyze enemy movement, forcing armies to move slowly and cautiously, or to avoid certain routes entirely. The mere threat of caltrops could be as effective as their actual deployment. Just imagine the paranoia that caltrops created. Every step became potentially dangerous, every road potentially deadly. Cavalry units, the elite forces of medieval armies, had to dismount and carefully clear paths before advancing, negating their primary advantages of speed and shock impact. Different cultures developed variations on the basic caltrop design. Some were larger, designed specifically to disable horses. Others were smaller and harder to see, intended to wound men on foot. Some were even designed to break off inside wounds, making removal difficult and infection more likely. The Romans had used similar devices centuries earlier, calling them tribuli, but medieval caltrops were more sophisticated, with better metallurgy and more strategic deployment. Medieval military engineers developed techniques for scattering caltrops in patterns that would maximize their effectiveness while minimizing the number needed. But here's the thing about area denial weapons. They don't distinguish between friend and foe. Armies that used caltrops had to carefully map where they deployed them, or risk having their own forces suffer casualties. This led to some of the earliest examples of what we might recognize as modern military cartography. The psychological impact of caltrops extended beyond the battlefield. Knowing that your enemy was willing to use weapons that targeted horses, animals that were often beloved companions to their riders, suggested a level of callousness that made other forms of negotiation or mercy seem unlikely. That says a lot about medieval warfare's evolution toward more systematic and strategic thinking. Caltrops represented a shift from individual combat prowess toward area control and strategic denial, concepts that would become central to later military doctrine. You think medieval combat was all about massive swords and thundering cavalry charges? Think again. In the shadows of medieval society lurked a weapon so precisely engineered for killing that it turned murder into a surgical procedure. The stiletto, a blade designed with one purpose: to slip between the joints of armor and deliver death with scientific precision. But here's what really happened when medieval weaponsmiths decided that sometimes warfare needed to be quiet, personal, and absolutely certain. The stiletto wasn't just another knife. It was a specialized tool that represented the dark side of medieval innovation, where the art of killing reached a level of technical sophistication that remains chilling even today. The stiletto emerged during the late medieval period as armor became increasingly sophisticated. Traditional weapons like swords and maces were designed for battlefield combat, but they were useless for close-quarters assassination work. What was needed was a weapon that could defeat armor not through brute force, but through precision engineering. You have to understand the anatomy of medieval armor to appreciate the genius and horror of the stiletto's design. Plate armor, for all its protection, had to have joints where pieces connected to allow movement. The armpits, the gaps between helmet and gorget, the spaces between leg plates. These were the targets that stiletto designers studied with scientific precision. The blade itself was typically between 6 and 12 inches long, narrow as a pencil, with a sharp point capable of penetrating chainmail or slipping between armor plates. The cross-section was often triangular or square, shapes that created maximum penetration while being difficult to seal, meaning that wounds from stilettos bled profusely and were nearly impossible to treat with medieval medicine. That's when things got really dark. Stilettos weren't just designed to kill, they were designed to kill quietly and efficiently. The narrow blade minimized initial trauma, allowing an assassin to strike without the victim immediately realizing they'd been fatally wounded. Death might come minutes later, long after the attacker had vanished into a crowd. But here's where the weapon's effectiveness made it a target for prohibition. Various city-states and kingdoms began banning stilettos not because they were ineffective, but because they were too effective for certain types of killing. The weapon was perfect for political assassination, settling personal vendettas, and other forms of murder that threatened social stability. Venice, in particular, developed strict laws against stiletto possession, recognizing that the weapon's design made it ideal for the kind of close-quarters violence that could destabilize their merchant-based society. The punishment for carrying a stiletto without authorization could be severe, sometimes death itself. Medieval fighting manuals reveal the sophisticated techniques developed for stiletto use. Masters taught students to identify the precise points where armor was vulnerable, how to approach targets without alerting them, and how to strike with maximum efficiency. This wasn't crude violence. It was systematic training in the art of surgical killing. Just imagine the psychological impact of knowing that your expensive, carefully crafted armor that might have cost you years of income, could be defeated by a blade that cost a fraction of that amount and could be concealed almost anywhere on an attacker's body. The stiletto also changed the nature of personal protection in medieval society. Bodyguards had to be trained not just to watch for obvious weapons like swords, but to identify the subtle signs that someone might be carrying a concealed stiletto. Fatal not because of immediate trauma but because of internal bleeding that was difficult to detect and impossible to treat with available techniques. That says a lot about medieval society's complex relationship with violence. Open combat with swords and axes was considered honorable, even noble, but the surgical precision of stiletto killings was seen as fundamentally dishonorable, effective, but somehow beneath the standards of civilized warfare. You think catapults and trebuchets were the ultimate siege weapons? Think again. Deep in the arsenals of medieval fortresses lurked a weapon so powerful it could punch through stone walls while being precise enough to target individual defenders. The arbalist, essentially a giant crossbow, that turned siege warfare from a battle of attrition into a systematic execution of anyone brave enough to show themselves on a castle's walls. But here's what really happened when medieval engineers decided that regular crossbows weren't devastating enough. The arbalist represented the pinnacle of medieval mechanical engineering, applied to the art of killing, a weapon so sophisticated and powerful that it could single-handedly change the outcome of sieges that might otherwise have lasted months or years. The arbalist was massive. Some versions stood over 6 feet tall and required multiple men to operate. The bow itself was made from steel or composite materials, generating draw weights that could exceed. To put that in perspective, a modern compound bow typically maxes out around 80 pounds of draw weight. The arbalist was operating on an entirely different level of mechanical force. You have to understand the technical sophistication involved in creating these weapons. Medieval engineers had to solve complex problems of metallurgy, mechanics, and materials science. The windlass systems used to draw the bowstring required precision gearing, while the trigger mechanisms had to be strong enough to hold enormous forces yet sensitive enough to release smoothly when activated. The projectiles fired by arbalist weren't just oversized arrows. They were carefully engineered instruments of destruction. Some bolts were designed to penetrate fortifications, with hardened steel points and weighted heads that could punch through several feet of stone. Others were designed as anti-personnel weapons,
with broadheads that could cut a man in half or multiple points that would create devastating wounds. That's when things got really interesting from a tactical perspective. The arbalest's accuracy meant that it could be used for what we might now call precision strikes. A skilled operator could pick off individual defenders from distances that made retaliation nearly impossible. Castle walls that had previously provided safety became death traps where exposure meant certain death. But here's where the weapon's effectiveness became problematic. The arbalest was so accurate and powerful that it fundamentally changed the nature of siege warfare. Traditionally, sieges were battles of endurance where defenders had significant advantages. The arbalest shifted the balance toward attackers, making traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Various military orders and kingdoms began restricting the use of arbalests, particularly in conflicts between Christian forces. The reasoning was similar to that behind crossbow prohibitions. The weapon was seen as giving unfair advantage to attackers and making traditional defensive tactics ineffective. Medieval chronicles described the psychological impact of facing arbalests during sieges. Defenders knew that showing themselves above the walls even briefly could result in instant death from projectiles they couldn't see coming until it was too late. This psychological pressure could break the morale of garrison forces even before physical damage to fortifications became critical. Just imagine being a castle defender in the age of arbalests. Your thick stone walls, which had protected your ancestors for generations, suddenly seemed inadequate against weapons that could punch through them like they were made of wood. The safety of your fortifications had become an illusion. The deployment of arbalest required significant logistical support. The weapons themselves were heavy and complex, requiring teams of specialists to transport, assemble and operate them. The projectiles were expensive to manufacture and difficult to replace in the field. This made arbalest strategic weapons that could only be deployed by well-funded military forces. Different regions developed their own variations of arbalest design. Some emphasized maximum power for destroying fortifications, while others focused on rapid reload times for sustained fire against personnel. The most sophisticated versions incorporated multiple bow assemblies or innovative loading mechanisms that allowed for faster operation. Medieval military manuals reveal the tactical doctrine that developed around arbalest use. Commanders learned to position these weapons for maximum psychological impact, often targeting highly visible defenders to demonstrate the weapon's power to the entire garrison. The goal was often to force surrender through intimidation rather than to destroy fortifications through prolonged bombardment. But here's the thing about arms races and military technology: defense always adapts to new offensive capability. Castle designers began incorporating features specifically designed to counter arbalests: thicker walls, angled surfaces to deflect projectiles, and covered walkways that protected defenders from precision fire. The social implications of arbalests were significant. These weapons required significant financial investment and technical expertise, meaning they were available primarily to wealthy kingdoms and military orders. This created a technological disparity that could determine the outcome of conflicts regardless of traditional factors like courage, skill, or numerical superiority. Medieval economic records show the enormous costs associated with arbalest deployment. A single weapon might cost as much as equipping dozens of infantry soldiers, while the specialized projectiles could be worth more than a common soldier's annual wages. This made arbalests symbols of wealth and technological sophistication as much as military capability. The decline of arbalests came not from prohibitions or moral considerations, but from the development of gunpowder weapons that offered similar capabilities with different advantages. However, the lessons learned from arbalest design influenced the development of early firearms and artillery, making these weapons crucial links in the evolution of military technology. That says a lot about medieval warfare's trajectory toward increasingly sophisticated and expensive military technology. The arbalest represented a turning point where technical superiority began to matter more than traditional military virtues, a trend that would accelerate with the introduction of gunpowder weapons. So there you have it. 6 medieval weapons so brutal, so effective or so threatening to the established order that they were literally banned from use. But here's what this really tells us about medieval society and human nature itself. These prohibitions weren't really about reducing violence or protecting lives. Medieval warfare was already incredibly brutal, with accepted weapons that could dismember, disembowel and torture enemies in the most horrific ways imaginable. The difference was that these 6 weapons threatened something more fundamental than individual lives. They threatened the entire social and military structure of medieval civilization. The crossbow and arbalist were banned because they democratized killing, allowing common soldiers to defeat elite warriors. Greek fire was so secret it banned itself through excessive secrecy. The morning star was prohibited because it caused unnecessary suffering, though apparently the necessary suffering of other weapons was perfectly acceptable. Caltrops were banned because they threatened non-combatants and valuable lives. The stiletto was banned because it made political assassination too easy and personal protection too difficult. You have to understand what this reveals about medieval priorities. Honor, social hierarchy, and military tradition were often more important than effectiveness or even human life. These societies were willing to accept massive casualties from honorable weapons, while banning more efficient alternatives that threatened established power structures. But here's the thing about trying to control military technology. It rarely works in the long term. Despite prohibitions, most of these weapons continued to be used throughout the medieval period and banned. Military necessity eventually trumped moral considerations, legal restrictions and social taboos. The legacy of these forbidden weapons extends far beyond medieval battlefield. They represent humanity's ongoing struggle with the moral implications of military technology. Today, we face similar debates about autonomous weapons, cyber warfare and other emerging technologies that challenge our concepts of acceptable combat. Just imagine if medieval kingdoms had successfully maintained their weapons prohibitions. Would warfare have developed differently? Would different military technologies have emerged? Would the social structures of medieval society have proven more stable?